Okay. Hello. I did Ethiopia and Liberia for my research assignment. And I mean, these two countries just on their own are kind of interesting in terms of analysis in Africa, just because they're two of the countries that weren't ever really under direct European control. Ethiopia declared independence in 1847, but from the private American Colonization Society, while Ethiopia was only under Italian control for about 6 years. They never really faced the full brunt of colonization the way some other countries did. So it's interesting to see how their politics kind of takes on a somewhat different shape than a lot of these other countries and how that manifests. In Liberia, most of the conflict initially came from the disagreements between the black settlers, the Americo-Liberians, and the indigenous groups there. The only successful coup in the country's history kind of came as a result of that, because the president, William Tolbert, he tried to liberalize the country to kind of mend that relationship between the two, but it didn't really end up working out, and he was ousted by a military official, Samuel Doe, from the Kron ethnic group, and his regime was very authoritarian, which eventually led to their first civil war. And something I thought was really interesting from the first civil war was the figure of Charles Taylor, who was a member of Doe's government. Doe was an extreme authoritarian, totalitarian type, so Doe accused Taylor of corruption. So Taylor fled Liberia to America, and then in America was arrested, broke out of prison in America, fled America back to West Africa, and from there started up his own rebel movement, kind of preying on some of the ethnic divisions sown by the Doe regime, specifically the Dio and Mono groups. I noted that Taylor kind of took advantage of the discrimination against them to recruit them for his ethnic group, even though I believe he was not a member of either group. He was an indigenous Liberian, but he wasn't a member of either of those two specific groups, which I thought was interesting. And just the kind of almost perpetual cycle of violence, like described in Rossler, and how that kind of relates to Liberia, because Tolbert kind of became corrupt, overthrown by Doe. Doe ruled really authoritarianly, overthrown by Taylor. And then Taylor ruled in this really increasingly authoritarian manner, where Doe was from the Kron, so then Taylor overthrew him, and then Taylor discriminated against the Kron, so then the Kron rose up against Taylor, who, again, I did not know this figure existed, but he was indicted and found guilty of 11 counts of war crimes in 2012, and I think something the article noted was that he was one of the first state leaders to be charged and convicted of war crimes since the Nuremberg trials, which is kind of crazy. So that's after the second civil war in Liberia, and he was found guilty of 11 counts of war crimes and sentenced to 50 years in prison. So I thought that was crazy, just because it's not something I'd ever really heard of before researching it, but hundreds of thousands of people were impacted by this. Someone was sent to prison for war crimes. A state leader was sent to prison for war crimes. So I thought that was really interesting in Liberia. And Ethiopia is kind of a similar case, just because of its unique political situation in Africa, because the empire of Ethiopia traces back to the 13th century. So when the emperor was overthrown in a coup in 1974, it opens up this huge power vacuum. A power vacuum that couldn't really exist anywhere else in Africa, just because that kind of legacy, that foundation of the same continuous government didn't really exist because of colonialism. There was kind of a huge destruction of that kind of indigenous power system, that traditional power system that we've talked about a lot. So it's really interesting how the fallout from that in Ethiopia, this one specific example, kind of could only exist in Ethiopia because the emperor, they also had a bunch of like traditional, they still had some kind of traditional like power structures that kind of brought them a lot of issues because it was kind of like halfway done to a point where they had a lot of things like feudalism and things that when they tried to modernize, because they were not directly impacted by colonialism, but they still had like half this kind of like that bi-cultural society model, but kind of like incredibly half-baked just because they were never directly colonized. So they were kind of stuck halfway in between. So they had a lot of unique issues with their land system, and that was a big issue for them. There were a lot of protests about that. That contributed to the whole the coup d'etat in 1974, where the Derg overthrew them, and then again the civil war in Ethiopia, the civil wars in Liberia versus the civil wars in Ethiopia was a contrast I thought was really interesting, because in Liberia it was never incredibly messy. Like the second civil war, the Kron groups were backed by Sierra Leone and Guinea because Charles Taylor had supported, a bunch of rebel groups there and helped rebel groups commit war crimes in those areas. But in Ethiopia, because of that power vacuum after the coup d'etat, from the absence of the monarchy, the civil war is just everyone's fighting. There was some ideological group, some Marxist groups opposed to the Derg, because the Derg was a Marxist group, but then there were other Marxist groups fighting them. There was some ethnic groups, and there was some Somali groups, some other ethnicities in Ethiopia had their own rebel groups. Even one of the ideological group that took power after the civil war, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, they were just a broad coalition of like 4 different ethnic rebel groups just united against the Derg. And that's again really interesting, because it's a kind of this crazy civil war where there's a bunch of people fighting. And again, maybe I've heard about it on a surface level, but I never really had this whole kind of deep dive into it. And just the fighting where there's like 17 different sides. There was a map of where all the rebel groups controlled, and it looked like toppings on a pizza almost, because every single part of Ethiopia just had this own little rebel group fighting the central government, and some of those rebel groups fought against each other. So that was bizarre. And then I'd actually heard a bit about the second civil war in Ethiopia, the Tigray War, just because that's been a little bit in the news recently. Not as prevalent as some like other contemporary things, but it's been talked about a lot, and just it hasn't been talked about enough, I think, really, just for the extent of the violence and the everything that's been going on there, because that's kind of a recent development, because the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, they were a member of the EPRDF up until like 2019, when they formed a new party, and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, a lot of their officials went to the Tigray region because they didn't want to listen to what the government had to say, just because they'd been pursuing a lot of policies they disagreed with. So then the violence escalated very quickly up until it went into full-on civil war in 2020. And there was like hundreds of thousands killed as a result of that. And just you don't really hear the news reporting on that kind of thing, even though it might be some of the worst violence there is in the world. Most of the time I'd hear people talking about it would be saying, why aren't people talking about this? And just kind of adding on to that, they signed a peace treaty. Ethiopia and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, they signed a peace treaty earlier in the month. I hadn't heard of that, and that's been going on for 2 years. Hundreds of thousands have been killed, and I didn't even hear about the peace treaty that was signed earlier this month, even though that could have big repercussions for the whole region because Eritrea didn't sign on to that. So it was basically just a really interesting deep dive into both of these countries that kind of have their unique political situations just because of their history, and how even despite these unique situations, all the problems that arise for them kind of tend to take on ethnic contours, even though they never suffered the full brunt of colonialism in the way a lot of other countries in Africa did. So I thought it was a really interesting dive into the both of these.